Hello, my name is Dave Cobb with Eastern Michigan Education Department. I am here to learn more about students with learning disabilities and how we help them. And joining me is my special guest, Elizabeth Treppa.
Hello.
Elizabeth is a teaching consultant with Dexter Schools. So, Elizabeth, when you suspect a student might have a learning disability, what is the process of determining that?
So when you suspect a student has a learning disability, the first thing that you want to do is do a student study. This usually involves a parent meeting with the school psychologist, the social worker, an administrator, the general education teacher, and usually the special education teacher. During this meeting, the teachers and the entire team collaborate to discuss what they're noticing in the general education setting. For example, what are the students' strengths? What are the students' weaknesses? And then they have some time to collaborate with the parent. For example, the parent might be going through a divorce. The parent might have lost the job. The parent might be having an illness, or maybe there's some tensions at home. It's important to be open during these meetings so that we can determine, is the student struggling in school because academically they can't do it, or they need some supports, or is there some external factors going on? If the team decides that they want to move towards special education, the first thing they need to do is a read. The read is usually done at the student study meeting, so everyone is at the same page at the same time so we can all discuss what services or what types of testing we feel like we need to do. During the read, usually we go ahead and we do observations, we do student interviews, we look at the student CA60, we look at their past test records, and we usually do a Woodcock-Johnson. During the Woodcock-Johnson testing, we look at the broad math, the broad reading, and the broad writing. And then we can actually dig a little bit deeper. Does the student maybe have issues with written expression? Do they have issues with reading fluency? Do they have difficulties with math calculation? So there's different variants within those tests that then we can look a little bit deeper. So if a student is struggling in math, maybe they have really good math fluency, but they have difficulties with math calculation. Or maybe the student has high reading fluency, but they might have low reading comprehension. So the test is really a good pinpoint for us to look at the student's standard scores and see which areas they have struggles in and which areas that they seem to be succeeding in. At the end of our testing and looking at the student and doing the interviews, the observation, and going through the student file, if we determine that the student requires an IEP, then we go ahead and we move forward with that process, which then involves another meeting or an IEP meeting. Or we might determine that the student doesn't qualify for services and would benefit from a 504 plan, which is another support, but more of a general education support rather than a special education support. So once we look at the IEP, then we can determine if the student needs a resource room setting, which is more direct, more intense, usually more minutes with the student, or if they required a teacher consultant, which maybe the teacher consultant checks in on the students a few times a week and meets with them in a less formal setting.
Now, the decision to whether put the student in a resource room or in a teaching consultant, is that based on arbitrarily defined numbers, or is this a case-by-case decision in your experience?
It's usually on a case-by-case situation. When we look at the student, if you have a student that really needs a lot of support, then a resource room setting would be more appropriate. If you have a student that maybe struggles just with reading fluency, so maybe they just need the test read to them, or maybe they just need access to audiobooks or some supports that the special education teacher can provide, then a teacher consultant role might be more appropriate. But nevertheless, it's a team's decision, so the IEP team, which would include the parent, the student, the general education teacher, the special education teacher, the school psychologist, the social worker, all of those would come into play when determining what services would be most appropriate for the student.
What kind of specific accommodations or modifications, for example, in your setting in Dexter, do the schools do to help these students with learning disabilities learn to the best of their ability?
It really depends on the individual student. It is really important when developing an IEP that you're doing it tailored towards a specific student. So none of your IEP accommodations will be consistent with another student. We really want to make sure that we're meeting the student's needs. For example, if a student has a reading disability, it might be appropriate for them to have tests read to them, homework clarified, also putting in that the student needs to repeat the directions back in their own words. This is something that I do a lot with my IEPs. I find that if students don't understand the directions, that it's hard for them to complete the task. So making sure that they understand the directions, that they can read them. It might be appropriate for the student to have an audiobook. And when we do audiobooks, we usually do them on MP3s, so that's more appropriate for the student. And also making sure that they have texts that are appropriate for them to be reading. With the students I work with in the middle school or high school level, they are socially aware of their surroundings and their peers. So if I'm working with a student that's in ninth grade but has a fourth grade reading level, I want to make sure that I have a book that's appropriate for them. Clearly, if I give a student in ninth grade a fourth grade reading level, that's not socially appropriate. So I need to make sure that the books are tailored and appropriate for them to be reading. So when it comes to reading disabilities, those are some that are just common accommodations that we use as a supplementary support.
Okay, so, as you said, it's not appropriate for a ninth grader to be reading, like, what did we read in fourth grade? Judy Blume. Mm-hmm. So if the class is reading, say, Of Mice and Men, how does the school accommodate him with a specific copy? Is there any special copies for him, or what?
That's where we start to be creative. It might be appropriate for the student to be in a book group where the text is being read to them, or what, like I mentioned, giving them the MP3 version. Or with a lot of books, you can actually find the books that from the outside look like the same book, but inside the materials are broken down, they're simplified, and it's more appropriate for their reading level. Actually, when it comes to a reading disability, it is important to note that there is struggles when it comes to reading comprehension, or the student might have difficulties with reading fluency. So it's really important to tailor the accommodations or the supplementary supports around the student's specific needs.
Could you very quickly explain the difference between reading comprehension and reading fluency?
Yeah. So, for example, when you have a student with a reading comprehension issue, it might be different than a student with a reading fluency issue. For example, you might have a student that it takes them double the time to read a test, but they might understand all the information correctly. But with a student with reading comprehension struggles, they might be able to read the test, they can read it fluently, they can go through it, but when they get done and you say, okay, now tell me, what questions are we answering? Or, hey, explain this to me in your own words. They might be completely confused. So when you're doing book clubs or when you're doing in-class reading assignments, it's important to do those quick checks to see, okay, does the student understand what they're reading so then they can complete the next task? Or does the student need it read to them because it takes too long for them to read it themselves and then they start to lose stamina?
So that's just a couple examples of how you wonderfully help students with reading disabilities. What about things like dyscalculia or math-related learning disabilities?
So once again, when it comes to math, there's different areas that the student might be struggling in. Once again, the math fluency. If a student is struggling to maybe answer those quick arithmetic problems, we might want to say, all right, here's access to a calculator, or here's access to a times table. However, if the student has difficulty with just the overall broad math, then it might be more appropriate for them to, have to explain what they're doing while they're solving the problems. So I have a student right now who has difficulty in math. So our goal is for the student to show mastery on the questions that are provided. So if the teacher gives 30 questions for the student to answer, I might tell the student, okay, show me how you do these 15 problems. Explain to me how you do these 15 problems. How would you walk through these steps? So a lot of students might be able to do the work with those supports like a calculator, while other students might need to talk through the problems. So once again, it's important that you tailor the supports around the specific student.
Some of that sounds extremely frustrating. What do you guys have to do for students that are just frustrated, whether it's because they have to explain everything or whether they're just not getting it? How do you help the students on the emotional side?
It is important that we implement positive behavioral supports, not just with our special education students, but with all students. So I know for me, when I'm presented with a task and it seems daunting, having those little words of encouragement are helpful. So for my students, when we start a task, we usually break it into chunks. So we're going to do 5 problems, then we'll take a few minute break. Okay, we're going to do this reading task, and then we can have some time on the computer. So making sure that you're giving those appropriate breaks or doing chunking, that's something that is extremely helpful. And also doing the praises and great job, look how well you're doing this, or hey, I'm going to let your teacher know that you're really progressing in this. So doing those little words of encouragement and also having manageable tasks for the students to do is important. The last thing we want to do is present a student with a task that's too overwhelming, because for a lot of our students, if it's already difficult for them, they're generally not even going to attempt it if it looks too much. So doing chunking or breaking it down into smaller sizes or having rewards at the end or even just giving those praises are usually beneficial.
We've covered reading, we've covered math. Now, can you tell us a little bit about students that struggle with writing?
When students have difficulty writing, sometimes we might want to put in various supports, like they have access to a word processor, or they have access to scribe services, or they have access to graphic organizers or rubrics. Some of our students, when we're doing writing assignments, the general education teacher might provide a rubric or an outline for them to follow. However, if it's not organized appropriately, or maybe there's just too many words on it, just having simple bullet points like topic 1, topic 2, topic 3, intro, conclusion, giving them some guideline on how to begin their organization for their writing task can be helpful. A lot of the general education teachers do have computers in their classroom. So I often tell my students, okay, open up a Google tab, go ahead and open up a new Google Doc, start your writing assignment and share it with me. Then the student and I can create a graphic organizer or an outline together so that we can make sure that we're completing the task.
What qualifies a learning disability, either in Dexter schools or by the state of Michigan?
That goes back to the IEP process. We have to see what the student is performing at, what areas they struggle in, what the areas of weaknesses are. And then as a team, we come together and we determine if IEP supports are appropriate. Sometimes they aren't going to be appropriate, so maybe doing a 504 plan where we can interject supports in an informal setting might be more appropriate. Something that you might want to keep in mind, Dave, is that when an IEP is being developed, those can change. So you might have an IEP that might be appropriate when the student is in 9th grade, but the next year the student might maybe have some difficulties that maybe the IEP doesn't address. So you have to be flexible with your teaching styles and with the supports that you're giving. You can always do amendments to IEPs to make sure that the supports that are put in place are appropriate. That would require an IEP meeting, but it is important to note that you just have to have some flexibility when working with students with special needs.
Thank you so much to my special guest, Elizabeth Chapa. Thank you again for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on this very cold snow day that we're having, and it was really nice to get to talk through some of this. I know I answered some of the questions quickly, but it was definitely fun.
I hope you all learned something about learning disabilities. Have a good one.